Amid a howling blizzard, retired firefighter Henry Brooks hears a faint scratching pierce the icy silence of his cabin. His heart races as he peers through the glass. A German shepherd shivers in the storm, two tiny pups clinging to her side, nearly buried in snow. Her desperate eyes lock onto his, pleading for rescue from a frozen grave. Henry's hand hovers over the doorknob. Torn, opening it could bring trouble inside, but turning away means their doom in the tempest. His next move will change everything. Before continuing the story, tell me which city you're watching from. I want to know how far this video has come. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so I can send you exciting stories like this every day. Thank you. The snowstorm raged outside, its icy winds battering the walls of Henry's cabin. Inside, the retired firefighter sat in his living room, the glow of the fireplace casting flickering shadows across the room. The blizzard had isolated him for days, and the silence was only broken by the occasional crack of the logs in the fire. Then a sound pierced the stillness, a faint, desperate scratching. Henry frowned, setting down his mug of coffee. He listened carefully, and there it was again, this time accompanied by a muffled whimper. He stood, his heart beginning to race. The sound was coming from the front door. Walking cautiously toward the entrance, Henry's eyes widened as he approached the glass door. There, framed against the swirling snow, stood a German shepherd, her body trembling from the cold. Pressed tightly against her were two tiny puppies, barely visible beneath her protective stance. Frost clung to her fur, and her breath came out in visible puffs as she gazed at Henry with eyes full of desperation. Henry froze, his hand hovering over the doorknob. He knew opening the door could mean bringing trouble into his home, but as her gaze met his, something deep within him stirred. The decision he was about to make would change their lives forever. Henry's heart pounded as he stood frozen in front of the door. The storm raged behind the trembling German shepherd, her breath fogging up the frosted glass. Her body was hunched over, shielding the two tiny pups that clung to her side. Their small bodies were almost buried under the snow, accumulating around them. Henry could see her ribs pressing through her fur, her coat matted with ice, and her eyes, pleading, desperate, and filled with a mix of fear and hope, locked onto his. "What the hell happened to you?" Henry whispered to himself, his breath misting the cold air inside the room. Instinctively, he reached for the doorknob. The moment the door creaked open, the icy wind surged into the cabin, carrying the storm's unforgiving chill. The German shepherd didn't move, her paws still planted firmly in the snow. She remained frozen in place, her gaze fixed on Henry as if unsure whether to trust him. "Come on, girl." "Get in here," Henry coaxed, crouching down to make himself less intimidating. "You'll freeze to death out there." The dog let out a soft whimper, glancing briefly at her pups before stepping forward, her movements slow and cautious. She nudged one of the pups with her nose, urging them to follow. The smaller of the two stumbled in the snow, its tiny legs struggling to keep up. Without hesitation, the mother gently picked it up by the scruff and carried it inside, followed closely by the second pup. As soon as they were inside, Henry shut the door behind them, blocking out the storm's relentless roar. The sudden warmth of the cabin caused the German shepherd to tremble more violently, her body adjusting to the temperature shift. Henry grabbed an old blanket from the couch and gently draped it over her and the pups. She flinched at first, but when she realized he wasn't going to harm her, she let out a long, shaky sigh and laid down near the fire, curling protectively around her puppies. Henry knelt beside her, his mind racing. The pups were tiny, their eyes barely open, and they were so frail that he could see their little chests rise and fall with labored breaths. He reached out to touch one, but the mother's low growl stopped him. It wasn't aggressive, just a warning, a reminder that she was still wary of him. All right, Henry murmured, raising his hands in surrender. "I get it. You're a good mom. You've been through hell, haven't you?" He stood and grabbed a bowl from the kitchen, filling it with warm water. Placing it near the dog, he stepped back, giving her space. She eyed him warily, but eventually leaned forward, lapping at the water as her pups huddled closer to her side. Henry watched from a distance, his thoughts swirling. Where had she come from? How had she ended up in the middle of a blizzard with two newborns? Her condition suggested she had been on her own for a while, long enough to grow weak and desperate, but not enough to give up. The fact that she had made it this far, carrying her pups through the storm, was nothing short of a miracle. But now what? Henry wasn't prepared for this. He had always been a dog lover, but his life had taken a quieter turn in retirement. He hadn't had a pet in years, and the idea of caring for 3 dogs, especially ones in such dire need, was overwhelming. Still, as he looked at the mother's exhausted frame and the way she curled protectively around her pups, he knew he couldn't turn them away. "You've got a fighter spirit. I'll give you that," Henry said, his voice soft. "Guess that makes 2 of us." As the night wore on, Henry worked to make them more comfortable. He laid out towels for the pups, placed a bowl of food near the mother, and stoked the fire to keep the room warm. The German Shepherd watched him closely, her eyes tracking his every move. But as the hours passed, her posture began to relax. For the first time, she let her head rest on the blanket, her eyes fluttering shut. Henry sat in his chair, the fire crackling softly beside him, and couldn't help but feel a strange sense of purpose. He had no idea what tomorrow would bring, but for now, he had done what he could. And as the storm raged on outside, he made a silent promise to the mother and her pups. They were safe, and he wouldn't let anything happen to them. The next morning, Henry awoke to the faint sound of soft whimpers and the crackling fire that had burned low during the night. The storm had passed, leaving behind a blanket of snow that glistened in the early morning sunlight. He rubbed his eyes, his mind immediately shifting to the unexpected guest who had sought refuge in his home. Turning toward the fireplace, he saw the German Shepherd still curled around her pups. The pups stirred slightly, their tiny bodies wriggling under her protective embrace. The mother's ears twitched at the sound of Henry's movements, and her amber eyes opened, locking onto his. There was still a guarded look in her gaze, but it lacked the desperation of the night before. "Morning, girl," Henry said gently as he stretched and walked toward the kitchen. "Let's see if we can get you something to eat." He rummaged through his pantry, grabbing a can of chicken soup. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. Henry warmed it up on the stove and carefully placed a bowl near her. She lifted her head, sniffing the air cautiously, and after a moment began to eat. The pups, sensing their mother's movement, let out small cries and tried to nuzzle closer to her warmth. Henry knelt down a few feet away, watching as she ate. "You're a tough one," he said softly. "Carrying those little ones through that storm? You deserve better than this." As the morning wore on, Henry took stock of their condition. The mother was visibly malnourished, her ribs stark against her thin frame. The pups, while frail, seemed to have enough fight in them to try to nurse, their tiny tails wagging slightly as they latched onto their mother. Henry's heart ached at the sight. He had seen his share of hardship during his years as a firefighter, but there was something uniquely heartbreaking about the quiet struggle of these animals. Deciding to help further, Henry made a quick call to the nearest veterinary clinic. "Hey, this is Henry Brooks," he said when the receptionist answered. "I've got a German Shepherd and her 2 pups here. They're in bad shape. Think you could take a look at them?" The receptionist's voice was warm but firm. "Of course, Mr. Brooks. We can squeeze you in this afternoon. Bring them over, and we'll do what we can." Henry hung up, relieved. He glanced at the German Shepherd, who was now licking her pups affectionately, her maternal instincts shining through despite her exhaustion. "You hear that, girl? We're going to get you some help." Getting them to the vet proved to be no small task. Henry found an old blanket and gently tried to coax the mother onto it. She hesitated, her body tense, and let out a soft growl when Henry moved too close to her pups. "It's okay," he reassured her, keeping his movements slow. "I'm not going to hurt them, I promise." After several minutes of gentle coaxing, she finally allowed him to lift her and the pups into the back of his truck. Henry secured the blanket carefully, making sure they were comfortable before driving toward town. The roads were still icy from the storm, and Henry drove cautiously, his mind racing with questions. Where had she come from? Was someone out there missing her? Or had she been abandoned, left to fend for herself in the brutal cold? At the vet clinic, the staff moved quickly, their practiced hands examining the mother and pups. "She's severely underweight," the vet, Dr. Elena, said as she ran her hands along the dog's bony frame. "But she's resilient. Her pups are lucky she made it this far. Dr. Elena glanced at Henry, her expression thoughtful. She's been through a lot. It'll take time for her to fully recover, but with proper care, she'll be okay. Do you know where she came from? Henry shook his head. She just showed up at my door last night. I couldn't leave her out there. The vet smiled softly. Well, she chose the right door. By the time Henry brought them back home, the mother seemed calmer. The pups, now full from their feeding at the clinic, wriggled happily as they nestled back into her side. Henry sat nearby, watching as the German Shepherd finally allowed herself to relax. She even let him sit closer, her eyes softening when he reached out to gently stroke her head. "You're safe now," Henry murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what you've been through, but you've got a place here as long as you need it." For the first time, the German Shepherd leaned into his touch, her body no longer rigid with fear. Henry felt a lump rise in his throat. He had opened the door for her out of instinct, not knowing what would come of it. But now, seeing her trust begin to grow, he realized that they had both found something that had been missing, a sense of purpose, and perhaps a second chance. The days that followed brought a steady rhythm of recovery and trust. The German Shepherd, who Henry had started calling Luna, was slowly regaining her strength. Her once sunken eyes began to shine with a flicker of life, and the pups, whom he had named Blaze and Rusty, grew more active with each passing day. Henry spent hours sitting on the floor near the fireplace, letting Luna grow accustomed to his presence. At first, she would watch him with cautious eyes, her body tense and protective. But little by little, the walls she had built around herself began to crumble. She allowed him to sit closer, her growls softening into occasional sighs. And eventually, she even let him pet her without flinching. One night, as the wind howled outside, Henry sat on the floor, his back against the couch, watching the fire dance in the hearth. Luna lay nearby, her head resting on her paws, while Blaze and Rusty tumbled clumsily over each other, their tiny tails wagging. Henry couldn't help but smile at their antics. "You've got some tough little ones there, Luna," he said softly, glancing at her. She lifted her head and looked at him, her eyes full of something Henry could only describe as gratitude. He reached out slowly, his hand brushing her head. To his surprise, she didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into his touch, her body finally relaxing. As the days turned into weeks, Luna's transformation was undeniable. Her coat, once matted and thin, began to shine with health. Her ribs were no longer as visible, and her energy returned in bursts. She played with her pups, nudging them with her nose, and watching them stumble around the cabin with tiny barks of excitement. Henry, too, found himself changing. For years, he had lived alone in the cabin, content with the quiet solitude of his retirement. But Luna and her pups had brought a new kind of life into his world. The once silent evenings were now filled with the sound of playful yips and the soft patting of paws against the wooden floor. He hadn't realized how much he had missed having a sense of purpose until now. One afternoon, as Henry chopped wood outside, he noticed Luna standing at the window, her nose pressed against the glass. Blaze and Rusty were playing near her feet, their tiny bodies tumbling over each other. Henry paused, wiping sweat from his brow, and waved at her. To his surprise, Luna wagged her tail. Just once, but it was enough to make his heart swell. When he returned inside, Luna greeted him at the door, her tail wagging slightly as she nudged his hand with her nose. It was the first time she had approached him willingly, and Henry couldn't hide the grin spreading across his face. "Well, aren't you full of surprises today?" he chuckled, kneeling to scratch behind her ears. Luna leaned into him, her tail wagging more enthusiastically now. Blaze and Rusty barked happily, circling around his legs in excitement. As their bond grew stronger, Henry began to wonder about Luna's past. Where had she come from? What had led her to his door that snowy night? The questions lingered in his mind, but he knew one thing for certain. Whatever her story was, it was one of survival and resilience. Luna had faced the worst of circumstances and had emerged with her pups by her side. She was a fighter, through and through. That night, as they all settled by the fire, Henry looked at Luna and spoke softly. "I don't know where you came from, girl, but I'm glad you found me. You and these little ones. You're part of the family now." Luna lifted her head, her eyes meeting his. There was something in her gaze, a quiet understanding, a bond that needed no words. She let out a soft sigh and rested her head on his lap, her body completely at ease for the first time since she'd arrived. Henry felt a lump rise in his throat as he stroked her fur. He hadn't expected this, hadn't expected the arrival of a stray dog and her pups to change his life so profoundly. But as he sat there, surrounded by the warmth of the fire and the soft sounds of Luna and her pups, he realized that they had given him something he hadn't even known he was missing: companionship, purpose, and a renewed sense of hope. Chapter 4. Shadows of the Past. The morning sun filtered through the cabin's windows, casting golden beams across the floor, where snow and ash playfully tumbled over one another. Luna lay nearby, her eyes half closed as she rested, but her ears perked at every small sound. Henry, standing by the kitchen counter, sipped his coffee and watched them with a sense of contentment he hadn't felt in years. But as peaceful as things seemed, a lingering question gnawed at the edges of Henry's mind. Where had Luna come from? She bore the signs of a hard life: her thin frame, the faint scars along her coat, the cautious ways she moved when startled. Someone had failed her, and Henry couldn't shake the feeling that whoever it was might still be out there. That afternoon, Henry decided to take Luna and the pups outside. The snow had begun to melt, revealing patches of frozen ground beneath. Luna stepped cautiously onto the porch, sniffing the air as if testing for danger. The pups, still unsteady on their feet, followed close behind, yipping excitedly as they explored the new world beyond the cabin. Henry smiled, watching them. "You're safe now, girl," he said softly. "Nothing's gonna hurt you here." But as they ventured a little farther from the cabin, Luna suddenly froze. Her ears shot up, her body tensing, as her nose pointed toward the edge of the woods. Henry followed her gaze, his own body stiffening. "What is it?" he asked, stepping closer to her. Luna let out a low growl, her hackles rising. Henry squinted into the trees, but he saw nothing. Still, the way Luna's body was positioned, protective, ready to defend, told him everything he needed to know. Something was out there. He quickly gathered the pups, cradling them in his arms as he guided Luna back toward the cabin. Once inside, he locked the door and pulled the curtain shut, his heart racing. Luna continued to pace by the window, her eyes darting toward the woods. Later that evening, as Henry sat by the fire, he couldn't shake the unease that had settled over him. Luna lay nearby, her pups nestled against her side, but she remained alert, her eyes flicking toward the door at every sound. Henry reached out and gently scratched behind her ears. "You're not just being paranoid, are you?" he murmured. "You've seen something like this before." His thoughts wandered as he stared into the flames. He couldn't imagine what Luna had been through to make her so wary. Had she been abandoned? Hurt? Henry clenched his fists at the thought. Whoever had done this to her had no right to call themselves human. The next day, Henry decided to get answers. He loaded Luna and the pups into his truck and drove into town. The local animal shelter was small but well-run, staffed by volunteers who knew most of the animals in the area. Henry approached the front desk, carrying a photo he had taken of Luna and her pups. "I found her outside my cabin," he explained to the receptionist, a kind-looking woman in her 40s named Tessa. "I was wondering if anyone's reported her missing or if you recognize her." Tessa studied the photo for a moment before shaking her head. "I don't recognize her," she said. "But dogs like her, we see them more often than we'd like. A lot of breeders out here keep dogs in terrible conditions. When they're no longer useful, they just abandon them." Henry felt a surge of anger boil within him. "You mean to tell me she was probably dumped?" Tessa nodded solemnly. "It happens more than you think, but she's lucky she found you." The drive back to the cabin was heavy with silence. Henry couldn't stop thinking about what Tessa had said. Luna had been discarded, thrown away like she didn't matter, but she did matter. To her pups, to him, and now he was determined to make sure she never felt unwanted again. When they arrived home, Luna stepped out of the truck and immediately began sniffing the air, her tail wagging slightly. Blaze and Rusty followed, their little legs working hard to keep up. Henry watched them, his heart swelling with both anger and hope. "You're safe now," he said firmly, looking at Luna. "No one's ever going to hurt you again." Luna turned to him, her amber eyes softening. For the first time, Henry felt that she truly understood what he was saying, and in that moment, he made a silent vow. Whoever had hurt her would never get the chance to do it again. The following days passed in an uneasy calm. Luna seemed to relax a little more each day, her trust in Henry growing stronger. Blaze and Rusty had begun to explore the cabin with boundless curiosity, filling the quiet space with their playful barks and tumbles. Yet despite the warmth and safety inside, Henry couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was watching them. It was late one evening when his unease was confirmed. Henry was sitting by the window, absently stroking Luna's fur as Blaze and Rusty dozed by the fire. The moonlight illuminated the snow-covered ground outside, casting long shadows across the yard. That's when he saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the woods. Henry's heart stopped. He leaned closer to the window, squinting to make out the shape. The figure was tall, cloaked in darkness, but unmistakably human. They didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there watching. "Luna," Henry whispered, his voice low. The German shepherd's ears perked up, and she followed his gaze. The moment her eyes locked on the figure, she let out a deep, guttural growl, her body tensing as she stood protectively in front of Blaze and Rusty. Henry quickly drew the curtains and grabbed his phone, dialing the local sheriff. "This is Henry Brooks," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "There's someone outside my cabin. I don't know who, but they've been standing at the edge of the woods for a while now." The dispatcher assured him that a deputy would be sent to check the area, but Henry's grip on the phone tightened. Something about this felt wrong, too deliberate, too personal. Minutes felt like hours as Henry waited for the deputy to arrive. Luna stayed by the door, her growls low and constant, while Henry paced the room, glancing nervously at the window. Finally, headlights pierced through the darkness, and Henry exhaled in relief as the deputy's car pulled into the driveway. Deputy, a tall, no-nonsense woman with sharp eyes, stepped out of the vehicle. Henry met her at the door, explaining what he had seen. "It wasn't just a random passerby," he said firmly. "They were watching us." Deputy nodded, her hand resting on the holster of her flashlight. "I'll take a look around. Stay inside and keep your doors locked." Henry nodded, his gut twisting as he watched her disappear into the woods, the beam of her flashlight cutting through the trees. He stood by the window, his hands clenched into fists as he waited. Luna sat beside him, her eyes fixed on the same spot, her body coiled with tension. When Deputy returned, her expression was grim. "There's no one out there now," she said, "but I did find tracks leading up to the edge of your property. Whoever it was, they were definitely watching the cabin." Henry swallowed hard. "Did you find anything else?" Deputy hesitated. There was a piece of rope tied to one of the trees. "It's old, but it looked like it had been used recently. My guess is someone's been using the woods as a camp." The thought sent a chill down Henry's spine. "Do you think they'll come back?" "I can't say for sure," Deputy replied, "but I'll have patrols circle this area more frequently. If you see anything else, call us immediately." After the deputy left, the cabin felt heavier than ever. Henry locked every door and window, his mind racing with questions. Who was out there? And why were they so interested in the cabin? And Luna? As he settled into the armchair, Luna came to him, pressing her head against his knee. He reached down and stroked her fur, his voice barely above a whisper. "Don't worry, girl. I won't let anyone hurt you or those pups." Luna let out a soft whine, her amber eyes meeting his. For the first time since she had arrived, Henry saw something in her gaze that he hadn't noticed before. Fear mixed with recognition. She knew something about the person in the woods, and whatever it was, it terrified her. That night, sleep didn't come easily for Henry. He stayed by the window, his rifle resting against the wall beside him, ready for anything. Luna lay at his feet, her ears twitching at every sound. Blaze and Ash snuggled together by the fire, blissfully unaware of the danger lurking just beyond the trees. As the hours ticked by, Henry made a silent vow. No matter what or who came for them, he would protect Luna and her pups at any cost. They were his family now, and he wasn't about to let their second chance be taken away. The first rays of dawn began to seep through the cracks in the curtains, casting a faint light across the cabin. Henry had barely slept, his mind racing with thoughts of the shadowy figure in the woods. Luna remained close to him throughout the night, her body tense and alert, while Snow and Ash slept soundly near the fire, oblivious to the unease in the air. Henry was about to pour himself another cup of coffee when Luna suddenly bolted to the front door, her ears perked and a low growl rumbling from her chest. Henry froze, his hand hovering over the coffee pot. He grabbed his rifle from the corner and slowly approached the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to peek outside. His stomach dropped. The figure was back, standing closer this time, just beyond the edge of the porch. "Damn it," Henry muttered under his breath. He tightened his grip on the rifle and turned to Luna. "Stay here," he said firmly, though he knew she wouldn't listen, opening the door just a crack. Henry stepped onto the porch, his boots crunching against the frost-covered wood. "Who's out there?" he called, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. "This is private property." The figure didn't move at first, but then it took a step forward, revealing a man in his 40s, his face shadowed by the hood of a tattered jacket. He carried a rope in one hand and a smirk on his face. "That's my dog," the man said, his voice calm but laced with menace. "I've been looking for her." Henry's blood ran cold. "Your dog?" he asked, his tone incredulous. "She showed up at my door half dead with 2 pups. If she's yours, why the hell did she look like that?" The man shrugged, taking another step closer. "She got out. Happens sometimes, but I'm here to take her back." Henry raised his rifle slightly, the barrel pointing squarely at the man's chest. "You're not taking her anywhere. She's not yours anymore." The man's smirk faltered, and he stopped in his tracks. "You don't know what you're dealing with, old man. That dog's trouble. She's better off with me." Henry's grip on the rifle tightened. "No, she's better off with someone who actually gives a damn. Now get off my property." At that moment, Luna appeared in the doorway, her body rigid and her teeth bared. She let out a deep, feral growl that echoed through the cold morning air. The man's smirk vanished completely, replaced by a flicker of fear. "Luna, get back," Henry ordered, but she didn't move. Her eyes were locked on the man, and for the first time Henry realized just how much she remembered. This wasn't a stranger to her. This was someone she had escaped from, someone who had hurt her and her pups. The man took a step back, the rope falling from his hand. "You've made a mistake, old man," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "You don't know what that dog's capable of." Henry took a step forward, his rifle still raised. "The only mistake was you thinking you could come back here and take her. She's not going anywhere, and neither are her pups. Now get off my land before I make you regret it." The man hesitated for a moment, his eyes flicking between Henry and Luna, before finally turning and retreating into the woods. Henry watched him until he disappeared from sight, the tension in his shoulders slowly easing. Back inside, Henry bolted the door and crouched down beside Luna, who was still standing guard. "He's gone," he said softly, stroking her head. "You did good, girl. You kept us safe." Luna let out a shaky breath, her body finally relaxing as she nuzzled into Henry's hand. Blaze and Ash stirred by the fire, their tiny yips breaking the silence. Henry scooped them up and placed them beside Luna, watching as she curled protectively around them. That night, as the fire crackled in the hearth, Henry sat with Luna and her pups by his side. He knew the man might come back, but he also knew that Luna wouldn't run this time. She had found her home, her family, and her courage, and Henry, in turn, had found something he hadn't realized he was missing: a reason to fight, to protect, and to love. For the first time in years, Henry felt truly alive. Together, he and Luna had faced the darkness, and together they would face whatever came next. When I imagine Henry standing there, rifle in hand, facing that stranger at dawn with Luna growling by his side to protect Blaze and Rusty, it sends chills down my spine. If I were Henry, would I have dared to open that door in the blizzard? Their story hit me deep. It made me realize how one small choice, like cracking open a door in a storm, can rewrite someone's entire life. I'm in awe of Luna, how she overcame her dark past to trust Henry. And I see in Henry a loneliness that melted away because of this extraordinary bond. They've shown me just how powerful loyalty and hope can be. If their journey stirs you like it does me, come along with me to uncover more beautiful tales. Subscribe to our YouTube channel today, hit that notification bell, and let's dive into stories of resilience and love between humans and animals together. Thanks for being here, and I can't wait to see you in the next video.